Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. Just a few words on simplicity, and then I will hand over to Matt. John Mark Comer, who I'm sure you've heard me talking about an awful lot, describes simplicity as limiting the number of our possessions, our expenses, activities, and social obligations to a level where we're free to live joyfully in the kingdom with Jesus. Put even more simply, Christian writer Jan Johnson says it's arranging your life around God. She says that life today is characterised by too much activity with too little meaning. I imagine many of us would agree with that. Jesus modelled a life of simplicity. He allowed God's space and time and priority in his life, which in turn left him free and equipped to do God's work among his people. Simplifying our lives allows us to focus more on God and people and relationships, just like Jesus. So to tell us more about this, here is Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. And thanks for turning up for an internal speaker rather than an exciting visiting speaker. So it's good to be. There you go. Well, thank you very much. Look at that. Look at that. Right. So I'm really enjoying this course so far, and so thanks to Liz for putting it together. Just a sense of what's come through to me is the need for our dependence on God for all of these things. These are not our achievements, because some of these topics could lead us to think we can really structure and order our lives in such a way that we've managed to live the perfect life, live your best life. And actually, I think what I've really gained so far is a sense of the need for dependence on God, for God to work in our lives. So that's been really encouraging to me. So I've been asked to speak about simplicity. I've got a few slides behind me here. And as I was thinking around this, I found myself asking myself this question. Do I ever think I don't have enough? Do you ever think you don't have enough? Whether that's enough money, enough time, enough friends, enough work, enough rest, enough holiday, enough food, enough fun, even enough love in your life? Like, do you find yourself thinking, I don't have enough? Is that a kind of common refrain in your life, in your thinking? A thought pattern even? I have to confess, I sometimes do find myself thinking that. I don't have enough. I won't say which of those things I say I don't have enough of, but I don't have enough. I don't have enough. And there are very real scarcities, not enough if you like, in our world. But when I really step back and think about my own life, I don't really experience the tragic scarcities of our world very much, if I'm very honest. So what I want to do tonight is to reframe how I see the world and how hopefully we see the world through the lens of abundance rather than scarcity. This is a bit of a theme of mine, so you may have heard me say this before, but it's very important for me to help to reframe the way I see the world through the lens of abundance rather than through the lens of scarcity. And the reason for that is I think that we are living in a world that's unprecedented in human history in some ways, that we're living in a materialistic culture that trains us to see the world in terms of scarcity, in terms of what we do not yet have. The key to simplicity is seeing things through the lens of abundance, through what God has given us and wants to give us in the future. So that may seem a counterintuitive take on simplicity, just to say let's talk about abundance, because often the simplicity is a kind of like it's a kind of a euphemism for decluttering or kind of downsizing even. So I do want to tackle our obsession with having more stuff in our heads, more stuff in our lives, if you like. But I think it's best done by reframing the way we see the world through the lens of abundance. So as I was preparing this talk, I came to a fresh sense of the abundance that I actually enjoy myself. My first slide, and I'll say a bit more about this, was, hang on, go back to it, was taken from the road upon which I live, or the road adjacent to where I live. This is from Whitehall Lane, from a walk the other week when the weather was a bit nicer than it is now. And I often try to think about how can I encourage my children to see the world through the lens of abundance as well. And sometimes, obviously their kids are clergy kids, they have this kind of particular burden to bear when they were both of us ordained. And sometimes, occasionally, it occurs to one of our children to ask me, Dad, how much do you earn? You're almost 50, how much do you earn, Dad? They live on the Surrey-Berkshire border after all, and it's all about how much you earn. Or, and I tend to like to say to them, wealth is what you enjoy, not what you earn or what you own. It's what you enjoy. Yeah, Dad, do you own a house? Do you own a flash car? No, how much do you earn, Dad? So wealth is what you enjoy. It's not what you earn. It's not what you own. I try to model that myself, but that's why I have found myself saying to them. So I'm going to be honest here. I'm going to put it out there. I hope it doesn't annoy you by saying this, but I live in a 5-bedroom vicarage in Surrey with a big garden and a greenhouse and a garage. They're not in the best nick, but I try to maintain them as best I can. I have a job that I enjoy most of the time. And I live 2 minutes from the station, 5 minutes from the station, 2 minutes if I'm running. And I live, as I say, along a lane that is really quite beautiful, just on the edge of Egham. I'm extremely blessed, and I have that courtesy of Esther's role here as your vicar, and the way the church organises itself, which I think is a kind of echo, in a sense, of the way that you could say is an echo of the way the Levites were structured in the Old Testament, that they were set free from possessions and from the need to earn to have land. They were actually given it as a gift, so that they could serve their role to be the kind of the heart of the worshipping life of the people of God. So I hope I haven't annoyed you by saying all that, but that's just doing an inventory of my own life. And I try to, in my job as a theological college, I try to say, just look at the abundance of what we're given. If we're training for Christian ministry, don't get into a sense of all the things that are difficult about it. Look at the abundance and the gift of it, rather than the scarcity of it. I hope I've done that. I hope partly to reassure you, I'm not going to come after you in this talk about how much you earn, how you use your money, how you live your time, about how green your lifestyle is. There are some fantastic resources out there for you to think about those things. I'm not coming after you, so I'm not on your case tonight on this question of simplicity. We might pick up in the kind of Q&A with Liz. I might pick up some of the things we can do more practically. But I want to encourage you to judge for yourself, to view your own life through the lens of abundance. Not to come after you, if you like, not understanding some of your challenges. I know some of the challenges from my family and friends of having a mortgage, or getting kids through school, or holding down jobs, managing a house, all these things, and the reality of our lives and the stuff that we have around us is tied up with the kind of lifestyles that we live in this part of the world. So I don't want to come after you about them. But what I do want to do is to reflect on some verses from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus speaks about not being anxious about the next day or about the future, and not being anxious, and also not storing up possessions or running after possessions, if you like. I want to leave that with you as a chance for you to judge for yourself, to discern for yourself, rather than me kind of banging you over the head with it. Jesus also teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives us a warning about hasty judgment of other people. So I'm going to leave that with you, and I'll come to those verses in a minute. Actually, let me come to them now. Let's go for it now. This is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labour or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendour was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the nations run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. But seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." I think the actual Greek says each day has enough evil of its own, so it's a bit more stronger than trouble, but you get the same impression there. So probably familiar, many of us will be familiar with those words. I would encourage you to sit with them, probably not in your groups now, but maybe some point in the week afterwards. I just want to say two things about them, and it's basically saying the same thing in two different ways. The first thing I want to say is, don't worry about worry. Sometimes people come at these verses and they get such a stewing, I live such an anxious life, I feel so terrible for living an anxious life. How can I live a less anxious life? And you kind of get into kind of circling around. And this is entirely not what Jesus wants to do. He's not trying to condemn us for anxiety, but to lift our eyes towards God's abundance in these verses. So a helpful response to this feeling of anxiety is never to blame or shame somebody, or to feel blamed and shamed ourselves. And I've lived with some elements of anxiety in my own life, so I feel I'm able to say something about it, or try and say something about it. There's likely to be some kind of, potentially some heritability to certain anxious traits. Not to go too much into that, but of course it can become a learned and self-reinforcing behaviour as well. And I think what Jesus does well in this passage is he links the kind of anxiety to possessions by saying it kind of begins in the mind, in the sense of wanting to control the future. The idea that anxiety in some ways is an inability to tolerate uncertainty, an inability to not know what's coming next, and so therefore you clutter your life, you protect yourself in various ways, and you try to ensure that you can control the future. I think Jesus is quite insightful in actually linking this pursuit of possessions and stuff to kind of an anxious heart that wants to control and have a futile security we can never actually have. And I think he gives also some really practical psychological wisdom here. Focus on today's troubles, the ones you can actually do something about. And that in psychological literature, we might talk about the difference between a kind of generalised anxiety disorder that's totally got floating worries, it's always going after all these things, and you have to kind of grab hold of those worry thoughts. A difference between that and actually forensically looking at what the issue is today, or maybe the issue tomorrow, that you can actually do something about, and the importance of discipline of that. So there are very real things that concern us and make us afraid and worried, and it's not wrong, but to focus on the things we can do something about, rather than that generalised floating anxiety. So Jesus is actually not far away from some contemporary psychological wisdom in what he says here. Of course, it doesn't mean we shouldn't plan or be astute for the future. It doesn't mean there shouldn't be insurance policies. As someone asked me about this passage once, it doesn't mean we should have no insurance. And actually, I'm going to say in a minute, Jesus is, I think, riffing on the Jubilee and Sabbath legislation in the Old Testament, which actually built up forms of insurance, forms of security for the community. So the Old Testament is full of legislation that builds in security for people in community. So it's not saying, be indifferent to these things. And Jesus teaches also on counting the cost. So it's not saying don't be future-minded at all, but note the link between the pursuit of possessions and security and a fundamental anxiety in us and a desire to control the future. So the second thing, which is really the same thing as another way to say, is that remember God's abundance. It's I think the best free therapy we can get is to reframe the way we see the world through the lens of abundance. And Jesus obviously gives a number of examples there in that passage of the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. And I was struck the other day just walking in the sunshine down the road. I sometimes take a 10-minute walk down the road just to kind of, when I'm trying to think something through, or and it's a privilege I have from living where I do, but I just noticed all this kind of yellow clothing on the field, if you like. And it's just buttercups, 2 a penny, very worthless flowers basically, that no one would ever sell or even gather, and yet quite a beautiful scene that it was created by them. And aware of the abundance we can get from engaging in the natural world, a sense of God's abundance, and that's the obvious practice we could or counter practice we could build into our lives. But I think there's perhaps more going on here than just kind of nature watching or bird watching in this passage. As I say, I do think there's a link to the Old Testament teaching about Jubilee in what Jesus is saying here. And you can see there's a verbal echo actually of the Jubilee legislation in Leviticus 25, when basically the people of Israel were told that obviously Sabbath, as you know, is 1 in 7, Richard Moy spoke about it the other week, and the Jubilee is like the super Sabbath. It's like the 7 times 7. It's like the 14 every so the 2 principles. Every 7 years, give the land a rest, and the people of Israel are told you can trust that the land will be abundant enough for you to manage that, give it a rest. But every 7 times 7, every 49 years, you actually reorder the way you organise the whole society. That's the vision. The degree to which they actually did it is a big debate, but that's the vision behind it. So the idea there was that in the Jubilee, the word Jubilee probably means release. There are basically 4 principles. Remember that the land is all God's. The land doesn't belong to anybody, and actually it belongs to God ultimately. You only have it as a tenant. You only have it because God is generous. That's the second principle. Remember, the land needs a rest as much as people need a rest. The third principle, that's why the land isn't to be exploited to the limit. So ultimately that will be a false economy because it will destroy the productivity of the land. And finally, remember, everybody gets a share in the land. Nobody is to be deprived of the means of wealth or production. And that happened as a vision, at least, every 49, 50 years. Now, you can debate whether it actually happened, but it's very clear, it's very important to the prophets. Isaiah brings it up, Isaiah 61, clearly about the Jubilee. And what does Jesus quote in his first talk in Nazareth, his hometown, Isaiah 61. And that's in Luke chapter 4. Clearly a vision that the heart of his understanding of how to organise a community. So of course we live in a very different world to that. But I want to say that the same principles still apply to us. Everything we think we own actually belongs to God, first and foremost. We're only tenants of it. We're only given trust of it. We only have it because God is generous. God is abundantly generous, wants to give us good things. Don't exhaust our resources to the limit, because they'll get diminishing returns if you try to do that. Your time, for example, your energy, your possessions. And finally, remember that everyone needs to get a share in God's abundance. So if your abundance is denying somebody else what they basically need, then that actually really isn't God's abundance, it's your overconsumption. So I would say basically in summary, Jubilee is a kind of a plan for a simple, sustainable abundance. So I would commend, looking at that passage from the Sermon on the Mount, commend thinking a bit about Jubilee, what it means. There's some great resources that Tia found a produce on this actually, called the Restorative Economy and then the Restorative Revolution. Is if you look at their website, some really good resources thinking through what does this mean in practice for us. And I just kind of, as I kind of close, I want you to audit your own life. Think, do you ever find yourself thinking, I don't have enough in all of those areas I mentioned earlier? Money, time, friends, work, holiday, food, fun, etc. I'm not here to judge you, but in the light of what is shared about God's abundance and the 4 principles of the Jubilee there, how could you reframe the way you see your life? How could you reframe it and see it in terms of abundance, what you do have rather than what you do not have? And how could that help you to live a simpler life, a more grateful life? I could say more, but I'll stop there. I've got some very practical to say in this kind of time now.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come and take a seat? That was really helpful, and actually a slightly different take to what's in the booklet. So I feel it covers something actually that is really missing, that concept of abundance, and just turning things almost on their head and looking at it that other way, which is really positive, because it can be quite guilt-inducing when you start thinking about simplicity and where we stop. So thank you very much for that. First question. For someone who's not familiar with or struggles with this practice, where would you start?
So the one thing I would say, and it's partly from our conversation beforehand, is think about your relationship with your phone. That might be the first thing, because I think I've talked about a materialistic culture, but I think there are many good things about phones, but they're kind of the ultimate icon of a materialistic culture is your phone. It's the first port of call for most of us, the first kind of the portal rather, through which we access and engage some of the assumptions of scarcity in the world. So think about your relationship with your phone. I've had to think about it for myself, and I've done lots of thinking about it, but it still has a power over me that I have to become aware of and audit on a regular basis. That's a pretty simple thing. The second thing I would say, and I've got this on the screen, is think about a rule of life of some kind. So get some kind of structure and order. I like structure and order, and some of what I've said has been quite principle or vision based, but I think where the rubber hits the road is actually think about, is the life you're living the life you want to live? I think John Mark Cope is brilliant on this kind of stuff. Is the life you're living the life you actually want to live? And one thing I found very helpful is to think about a rule of life. And has anyone ever come across that term, a rule of life? It has some basis in the monastic community. It's become really popular. There's lots of books about it now. I put on the screen there. And it was introduced to me probably about 10, 12 years ago, and the idea of actually, and I found really useful to present a visual picture of how I wanted to organise my life. So I actually produced a kind of picture and diagram with words on it. That's how I felt my life, the life I wanted to live was organised. As you do, I can attach the Bible verse to something. We don't have to do that, but actually think, well, what are the parts of my life where I am engaged and I have responsibilities? How can I begin to become aware of how I want to structure it better? Let's give you this now. So there's this book I came across when I first looked at this, was a book called God in My Everything by Ken Shigematsu, the Canadian pastor, and he uses the image of the vine and the trellis, and the kind of image from the natural world and human engagement in the natural world, and that our lives are like a vine that is growing and can be abundant, but we need to kind of to manage that growth so it's fruitful. And the kind of structure of our lives is the trellis. So that's I would say begin to take account of your life. Is it the life you want to be living in the area of possessions? When you read Jesus' words, are you challenged by them? Is it not the life you want to be living? And then get a hold of your life, and the rule of life, I think, is a really good way I've found to do that.
Thank you. And I think as well, looking at the vine, that element of pruning that none of us like to think about, but that's so essential for growth and fruitfulness. Sometimes we do need to prune certain things out of our lives in order to focus on what's important. Second question, what would you suggest for anyone wanting to go deeper with simplicity? So beyond what you've already suggested.
Well, I can go deeper into rule of life briefly because something I prepared earlier. So you mentioned pruning now. I think there's a lot of fruitfulness in looking at this area of a rule of life. So you can pass these slides on to you, but this is about the kind of process we go through. There's quite a lot of similarity and overlap between different books. My life, and my living rather, is I tend to look at books and discover what they're saying, whether it's the same in one book or another book. So that's why I tend to do comparing and contrasting sort of my professional skill set. So I've given you two books here that say fairly similar things about how to organise our lives. And so they kind of are the lives we want to be living that kind of align with our principles and values. I think another thing I'd say if you want to go deeper is be aware of self-righteousness potentially. Like coming back to what I was saying earlier, if we look at the way that our economy works, if we look at the way that the assumptions that we find all too easy to hold in this part of the world, it's easy to get quite angry and annoyed about them, about the thirst for more, the way that we are manipulated to buy stuff we don't need. And then you can get in a kind of campaigning bent, and I have some time for that, maybe some skin in that game if you like, but actually be aware that none of this is about our anger won't necessarily change the world, or for our frustration won't necessarily change the world. It needs to be aligned to a living spiritual engagement. God needs to empower that in us, and only God can change others and change the world. There are practical ways to organise ourselves to campaigning to live better kinds of lives, but beware of those who want to go deeper in this and invest in it and speak about decluttering or tackling materialism. Beware of the tendency to self-righteousness. I think that's quite an important thing to say. That's partly why I've taken the topic the way I have tonight. This is something God wants to do in us. Jesus is at the centre of his kind of landmark teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. So it's really, really important to Jesus that the way we live our lives, the way we see possessions, it's so crucial. It's a spiritual issue. Therefore, let's ask for God to equip us to do it. Let's seek dependence on God rather than thinking this is all about our level of knowledge or our campaigning against other people. Does that help at all? I think I've gone in strong on that because I'm aware that's my own tendency to say, well, look what they're doing over there, that's that terrible. And actually, my own assumptions are not necessarily that different, just live on a different scale. So how can I deal with my own assumptions first of all?
Thank you. And I think as well, like you said, it's that sense, just realising that we are more at the mercy of external forces than we realise is a good starting place, because at least then we can start to check ourselves and question our motivation. That whole dopamine hit with our phone, with social media, that way that we're being kind of trained into being more of a consumer society, and just catching ourselves and starting to question what's necessary and helpful. So what change would you hope to see in our church and community as a result of us all focusing more on this?
I will come to that question, but you just triggered a thought in my mind. If you wanted to think more about this, how we're shaped by what happens in the world, and you like to read or watch stuff online, James K.A. Smith, really fascinating stuff on cultural liturgies, how everything is shaping us to worship something. Really, really interesting. And let's say that an hour online or walking in a shopping mall or watching a football match is shaping you to worship something, and then seeing us all as worshippers. And actually that's the battle, is a battle of what's true worship. So I really recommend that. I think when I saw that question, I wanted to say that I think the church has got to model something here. The Jubilee vision is given to the people of Israel. It's not given, we can't draw a line from that and say it's given to the UK government. Say they should organise the government, they should organise the way our tax system or our land or property values in this way. There's some great principles actually in there, and there are actually quite a lot of warnings about free riders and abuse of that it's not naive legislation, put it that way. It's not naive actually. So there's quite a lot of principles that governments could take in hand, but actually I think that it's given for the church to model something that is different in the way that we own things communally, potentially. I do think, and I put a slide on here somewhere. I do think the community fridge is a great example actually of I know it's got some challenges in making it work practically, legally, etc., within the used by, etc. But it's a really great principle of taking what would be wasted by an over-consumptive society and turning it into a form of celebration and community, people queuing up and gathering together. I think it's got a real power, and the way it's gathering people to come to it who are not part of the church, I find very moving actually very often. I don't know who these people are. I want to play football on Thursday night and I see him serving there on Saturday morning and had no idea had any connection with the church whatsoever. And it's very new to him, I think, to have that connection. So I think that's a great example of a piece of work that is doable and models something like the Jubilee values. So anything where people come together and see things as ultimately belonging to God and held in common for the blessing of all is, I think, a Jubilee principle for the life of the church. So there's a lot going on already. I'm not sure I can recommend new initiatives as such, but if you want to go and think about how you might organise a society or advocate for this, Tier Fund, recommend Tier Fund resources, restorative economy, restorative revolution, that kind of material. And also obviously Rosh and other great organisations like that, thinking about how we can use our footprint, our land, our shared God's acre, if you like, here, how we can use it in a way that aligns with the kind of principles we see in the Jubilee.
Thank you very much. You've given us some really good food for thought, and thank you for taking the time as well to prepare and come here this evening. So I'm sure everybody will join me in saying a big thank you.